And while the world absorbed the blow, comparisons began swirling. Veteran commentators recalled the announcement of Princess Diana's passing, the stillness, the disbelief, the sudden vacuum of information. Others thought of the Queen's death, a moment where time itself seemed to pause. Yet this felt different. This wasn't about the passing of an era or the loss of a figurehead. This was about a boy, a child whose face had once brought levity and charm to official appearances, now reduced to a name in a heartbreaking statement. What haunted everyone wasn't just the sadness, it was the finality. The words used were not the ones typically reserved for temporary setbacks or minor health scares. They sounded conclusive. They sounded irreversible. In that moment, Britain didn't just hold its breath. It began to grieve, not because it fully understood what had happened to Prince Louis, but because it feared it already did. But as the nation focused on what was said, palace insiders knew the real gravity lay in what William and Catherine were still holding back. Royal statements are designed to calm, but this one unsettled. Every sentence felt weighed down by omission. Analysts noticed the pauses, the softened phrasing, the conspicuous absence of reassurances. This was not the language of optimism, it was the language of preparation. And within minutes, seasoned observers began asking the most frightening question of all: what were William and Catherine not ready to say out loud? In the immediate aftermath of the statement, newsrooms didn't just report, they dissected not just what was said, but how it was said. The tone, muted and mournful, was more telling than the words themselves. Gone were the polished phrases of reassurance. There were no timelines offered, no assurances of a return to normalcy, no comforting statements like expected to make a full recovery or currently resting and responding well. Instead, the message hovered in a state of suspended emotion, calm on the surface but deeply unnerving underneath. The wording itself appeared to be the product of long, painful deliberation. According to insiders, palace aides reportedly spent hours redrafting it, pausing between every sentence, aware of the implications each word would carry. They weren't just composing a press release, they were preparing the public for something irreversible. The careful omission of medical terms, doctors' names, or even the phrase "health issue" spoke volumes. It was less a statement of clarity and more a surrender to something they could no longer control. What stood out most, however, was what wasn't said. There was no mention of when Prince Louis might be seen again in public, no hint of return to school engagements, no allusion to future events where he might reappear beside his siblings. The absence of any projection made it clear this wasn't a delay, it was a derailment. And behind closed doors, whispers grew louder that this crisis had been brewing for far longer than anyone realized. Journalists who had covered the monarchy for decades began revisiting recent footage of Prince Louis. Smiles that once seemed playful now looked forced. Moments dismissed as childhood mischief were being reinterpreted as signs of something deeper. Even body language between William, Catherine, and Louis in past public appearances took on new meaning. There had been signs. Only now were people starting to recognize them. The public was not the only one caught off guard. Some palace staff reportedly learned about the full scope of the issue only hours before the statement was released. Their shock, their grief was not performative, it was raw. It wasn't just about a child in distress. It was about the collapse of an illusion, the belief that the youngest members of the royal family, shielded by security and routine, were somehow immune to the chaos of real human struggle. And perhaps most devastating of all was the creeping realization that this was not temporary. This wasn't a break from royal life. It was the quiet beginning of something permanent. Not an announcement of loss, but a preparation for it. The royal facade had cracked, and behind it stood two parents desperately trying to delay the inevitable exposure of a pain they could no longer contain. And then, breaking centuries of royal instinct, Prince William did something no one expected. He spoke from the heart, not the institution. There was no script, no podium, no shield of formality. When Prince William spoke next, it was not as a future king, but as a father unraveling in real time. His voice faltered. His composure wavered, and in that moment the monarchy's most carefully guarded illusion collapsed. This was grief, fear, and helplessness laid bare for the world to witness. The moment William stepped into the spotlight, it became immediately clear that something had changed. This wasn't a speech, it was a confession, the carefully curated image of the poised, steady Heir W. As gone, replaced by a man struggling to hold back emotions that had long been boiling beneath the surface. He didn't open with the usual pleasantries. He didn't begin by thanking the press or the public. He began by saying, "I should have seen it sooner." That sentence alone brought an entire nation to a standstill. In those 6 words, William dismantled decades of royal distance. He spoke not as someone with power, but as someone who had failed. He described the months of quiet tension within the palace, how Louis had grown quieter, more withdrawn, and how the family had initially dismissed it as a phase. He admitted that palace life, with all its rituals and obligations, had masked what was truly happening at home. And with each passing day, the signals became easier to overlook, not harder. But beneath the candor was a deeper truth, one that revealed the crushing guilt William carried. He spoke of nights spent pacing the corridors, wondering how he of all people hadn't known how he could be so attuned to national affairs and yet so blind to the pain in his own home. He recalled moments when Louis would ask to skip family engagements, moments when his laughter seemed rehearsed, moments when his eyes, once so full of wonder, looked hollow. And still, William admitted he did nothing because he didn't want to believe. One memory, however, shattered his voice entirely. William paused, tried to gather himself, and then whispered what Louis had once asked him. "Do I have to smile when I don't feel it?" It was a question that cut deeper than any royal crisis ever could. It wasn't rebellion. It was a plea, a cry from a child drowning in an ocean of unspoken expectations. That moment, William confessed, was when he finally saw his son clearly, and it nearly destroyed him. He didn't hold back. He revealed how the emotional toll had affected everything. His marriage, his role as a father, even the dynamic between George, Charlotte, and Louis. The balance in the household had tilted. Catherine tried to hold it together. George had grown more serious. Charlotte had started watching Louis with eyes that mirrored their mother's quiet worry. Perhaps the most devastating admission was that their attempt to protect Louis had, in fact, isolated him. William said it plainly: "In our effort to shield him from the world, we built walls that even we couldn't see through." The words echoed like thunder. For the first time, the world saw what it meant when royal duty collided with parental instinct, and how the damage wasn't always visible until it was nearly irreversible. But while William spoke publicly, another child in the family was already breaking quietly behind closed doors. Princess Charlotte was never meant to carry this weight. Yet, as Prince Louis retreated inward, it was his sister who stepped into the spaces he left behind. Her young face, usually so full of joy and mischief, now wore a mask of concern, of quiet understanding far beyond her years. Behind the carefully constructed words of the palace statement, there was a deeper truth that resonated louder than anything on the page. The royal family, long known for its poise, its composure, and its unwavering control, had lost that control, and in its place an unspoken, raw vulnerability began to emerge. For the public, this was not just a matter of a family in crisis. It was the revelation of something far more unsettling. A family whose carefully constructed facade had cracked, revealing the depths of their emotional fragility. The words, or rather the absence of words, spoke volumes. They were no longer the reassuring, measured phrases that had characterized royal communication for centuries. They were heavy with unspoken fears, with the weight of a grief too immense to fully articulate. The silence that followed the statement wasn't broken by questions or speculations, as one might expect. Instead, there was a deep, collective understanding that reverberated across the country. A nation usually so quick to dissect royal affairs found itself caught in a moment of stillness, reflecting on the weight of what had just been revealed. This wasn't just a medical issue, this was something much more profound, something that had shaken the very foundation of the royal family. The public, so used to seeing the monarchy as an untouchable institution, was suddenly forced to confront the reality that even the most privileged and powerful family in the world was not immune to the fragile, unpredictable nature of human existence. What was most unnerving in the aftermath of the statement was not the content of the message itself, but what had been left unsaid. There were no reassurances, no promises of recovery, no statements about a return to normalcy. It was, in its very essence, an admission of uncertainty. The royal family, which had always known how to project an image of strength and stability, was now exposing the painful truth that they were, like everyone else, rebel to forces beyond their control, and in that vulnerability there was no comfort. Instead, there was only the quiet, unspoken plea for understanding and space, for the kind of grace that could help them navigate an emotional and personal crisis far greater than anything they had ever been prepared for. For the insiders within the palace, it became painfully clear that this moment marked a profound shift, not just in the royal family's personal lives, but in how the world would view them. There was no roadmap for this. How could one continue with the usual royal protocols and formalities when the weight of the situation demanded something far more human, far more real? How could the palace continue with their public appearances, their royal engagements, their perfectly crafted image, when the very foundation of their world was crumbling beneath them? There was no precedent for this. No past royal crisis had ever been handled with such raw emotion, with such open vulnerability. As the world processed the statement, the questions began to swirl. Was this simply a temporary crisis, a minor health issue that would soon be resolved, or was it something far more serious? People began to wonder whether the royal family was trying to protect Louis from the prying eyes of the world, shielding him from the pressures of public life. But that theory began to fade as more details, or rather the lack of them, began to emerge. No timelines were offered, no assurances were given. What was happening to Prince Louis wasn't something that could be wrapped up in the neat, comforting narratives the monarchy had long relied on. Instead, the absence of any clear explanation suggested a much deeper, more complex issue at hand. And so the public began to wonder, was Louis facing a health crisis that was too serious to disclose? Had something more sinister occurred behind closed doors? Was the family merely trying to manage the situation quietly without drawing undue attention to it? The speculation was rampant, but the one thing no one dared say was what everyone was truly feeling, that the royal family was facing something far worse than they were willing to reveal. And in the silence that followed, that unspoken truth grew louder with every passing moment. In the immediate aftermath of the statement, the newsrooms didn't just report the facts, they dissected them. They didn't just analyze the content of the message, they analyzed the tone, the pauses, the carefully crafted omissions. The word choices, deliberate, measured, and somber, told a story all their own. Gone were the polished, reassuring phrases that were once a staple of royal communications. There were no comforting statements like making a full recovery or resting and recovering well. There were no promises that Louis would be seen again soon. Instead, the message lingered in a state of suspended emotion. It was calm on the surface, but beneath it, there was an undeniable undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. This wasn't just a carefully drafted press release. It was a carefully constructed message that sought to prepare the world for something irreversible. The wording itself suggested that the family was confronting a reality that could not be undone, a crisis that could not be easily fixed. The absence of medical terms, the lack of mention of doctors or diagnoses spoke volumes. It wasn't a statement of clarity, it was a statement of surrender, an acknowledgement that something far greater than any medical issue was unfolding. The omission of any future projections, when Louis might return to public life, when he might rejoin his siblings in their royal engagements, spoke the loudest. There were no illusions of a temporary break. This wasn't a delay, a setback to be overcome. It was a derailment. And in that derailment, the royal family was forced to face the reality that their youngest member, the child who had once been a symbol of joy and lightness, was now at the center of a crisis too deep and too painful to navigate within the constraints of royal protocol. The public, however, did not wait for the palace to confirm or deny what they already suspected. They began to see the cracks beneath the surface, the moments of uncertainty, the raw emotions that had been hidden for so long. What had once been a family shielded from public scrutiny was now exposed in a way that no one could have anticipated. For the first time, the world saw what it truly meant to be part of the royal family, not just the perks, the privileges, and the titles, but the weight of living a life under constant pressure, constant expectation, and constant public scrutiny. And as much as the monarchy tried to protect its image, the truth had come spilling out in a way that could not be contained. Behind the palace walls, whispers began to grow louder. This crisis had been brewing for far longer than anyone had realized. The signs had been there if only anyone had been willing to see them. The outside, Prince Louis had always appeared carefree, charming, and full of energy. But those who had been close to the family began to recognize the subtle changes, the moments when Louis seemed less animated, less engaged. The smiles that had once been bright and genuine now appeared forced, as if he were trying to convince the world that everything was fine when deep down he was struggling. Even the body language between Louis and his parents had shifted. Where once there had been playfulness, there was now a distance, a subtle but unmistakable tension. It was as if the family had been trying to hold everything together, to project an image of normalcy, when in reality they were falling apart. But it wasn't until the statement was made that the full weight of the situation came crashing down on everyone. The royal family, so accustomed to living in the spotlight, had been forced into a position where they could no longer hide behind their public roles, their carefully constructed facades. They were now simply a family in crisis, facing the very human struggle of trying to protect their child from a world that demanded more of him than he could give. And as the nation grappled with the uncertainty of the situation, the royal family retreated into themselves. Behind closed doors, the decision was made to remove Prince Louis from public life completely. There would be no grand farewell, no staged photo ops, no carefully crafted image to mark his absence. There would be only silence, and in that silence, something profound began to shift. For the first time in modern history, the royal family had chosen not to put on a show for the world, not to mask their pain behind a carefully curated public image. They had chosen to protect their child in the only way they knew how, by stepping back, by removing him from the public eye, and by giving him the space to heal. The world watched, but they didn't get answers. They didn't get the closure they had been conditioned to expect from the royal family. Instead, they were left with a truth that was more unsettling than anything they had ever heard before. The monarchy, in all its grandeur and glory, had been stripped of its perfection, laid bare for all to see. And in that vulnerability, something unexpected happened. The public began to change their view of the royal family, not as a distant, untouchable institution, but as a family, struggling, learning, growing, and doing the best they could to protect their child from the weight of an unforgiving world. And so, as the days and weeks passed, the conversation shifted. The focus was no longer on the family's image, but on their humanity. And for the first time in decades, the monarchy began to look less like a fortress of tradition and more like a family that for all its power was still subject to the very same trials and tribulations that every family faces. The moment William stepped into the spotlight, the weight of the royal family's struggles became undeniable. For years, the monarchy had existed behind a carefully constructed wall of formality and tradition. It was a world where appearances were meticulously managed, where emotional vulnerability was never aired in public, and where the true inner workings of the royal household remained hidden from the eyes of the world. But in this raw, unguarded moment, all of that was stripped away. Prince William's voice trembled as he spoke, a sharp contrast to the confident, poised figure he was known to be. This was not the future king speaking. This was a father deeply shaken, unable to mask the turmoil he had been quietly grappling with for months. It was a moment that marked a dramatic departure from the monarchy's usual approach to crisis. William's words were not scripted, they were unscripted and in some ways desperate. He wasn't playing the role of the monarch-to-be, he was simply a father who had realized he had failed his child. When William began with the words, "I should have seen it sooner," the entire nation seemed to hold its breath. Those 6 words shattered the long-standing illusion of royal infallibility. The prince wasn't just confessing to his personal failures, but to a much larger, far more painful reality, that even the royal family, with all its wealth, influence, and resources, was not immune to the weight of human suffering. The crown, so often a symbol of untouchable authority and strength, was no longer seen as the distant institution it had once been. It was now a family, struggling with the same heartbreak, the same fears, and the same overwhelming sense of helplessness that so many others faced. William went on to recount the signs that had been ignored, the moments that had been dismissed as mere childhood phases. There had been subtle shifts. Louis had become quieter, more withdrawn, yet his parents had written it off as nothing more than a passing phase, a normal part of growing up. But as the months wore on, the cracks in the family's facade began to show. William admitted that the duties of royal life, the public appearances, and the constant obligations had, in many ways, blinded him to the reality of what was happening at home. The palace had been a sanctuary from the outside world, but in their attempt to shield Louis from the pressures of public life, they had inadvertently isolated him even more. William's voice faltered as he shared a moment that would forever haunt him, a simple question from Louis that spoke volumes. "Do I have to smile when I don't feel it?" It wasn't just a child's innocent inquiry, it was a cry for help, a sign that the emotional strain Louis had been under had finally broken through. William paused for a long moment, the weight of that memory nearly overwhelming him. It was a question that no parent should have to hear from their child, let alone a member of the royal family, and in that moment, it became clear to the world just how deeply this crisis had cut into the heart of the family. As the nation listened to William's raw confession, there was a sense that something much larger was unraveling than just the health of one young child. This wasn't simply a medical issue or a passing difficulty. It was the collapse of the carefully crafted image of the royal family. William spoke of the toll that Louis's struggles had taken on their entire family dynamic. His marriage with Catherine had been affected. Their other children, George and Charlotte, had begun to sense the changes too. George had grown more serious, more withdrawn. Charlotte, with her perceptive nature, had watched Louis with a growing concern that mirrored their mother's quiet worry. But perhaps the most crushing part of William's confession was when he admitted that, in their effort to protect Louis from the public eye, they had inadvertently built walls around him that even they couldn't see through. In trying to shield Louis from the weight of royal expectations, they had inadvertently isolated him, pushing him further into himself. The family's attempt to protect Louis had, in the end, trapped him in a world that no one, not even his parents, fully understood. And now, as William spoke these truths to the world, there was no denying that the damage had been done. The walls they had built to protect him had become a prison. As William's words continued to pour out, it was clear that this moment marked a shift in how the monarchy was perceived. The royal family had always been seen as the epitome of strength, resilience, and poise, but in that moment they were seen as a family in crisis, struggling to hold onto the very things they had spent a lifetime building. The public's perception of the royals had always been one of distance, of being untouchable, above the struggles of the common person. But in William's heart-wrenching confession, the monarchy was laid bare. It was no longer an institution, but a family in turmoil, struggling with the very human experience of trying to protect their child from the weight of a world that demanded more than he could give. Behind closed doors, however, the crisis was far from over. As the family struggled to process what had been exposed to the world, another child, Princess Charlotte, quietly stepped into the void left by her brother. It was never meant to be her responsibility, but as Louis retreated into himself, it was Charlotte who began to shoulder the unspoken weight. Her young face, once full of the carefree joy of childhood, now bore the quiet burden of worry. She had become, in a way, a silent caretaker, watching over her brother, her family, and the emotions that were too painful for anyone to articulate. The world, meanwhile, continued to watch as the royal family's facade crumbled piece by piece. And while the focus of the public was on William's confession, there was a growing sense that this crisis was far from over. As the family withdrew further from the public eye, the speculation intensified. What would happen next? Would Prince Louis recover, or would this be the beginning of a far longer and more painful journey? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what would the royal family look like after this? Would they ever return to the polished, dignified image they had worked so hard to cultivate? Or would they, like so many others, be forever changed by the raw and unfiltered realities of life? In the months that followed, the royal family faced not just the public scrutiny, but the even deeper challenge of healing their own wounds. It was a journey they had not prepared for, and yet it was one that they would have to navigate together. The monarchy's future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Whatever happened, they would no longer be the untouchable institution they once were. They were a family, vulnerable, struggling, and very much human. And in that humanity, the world found something unexpected, a deep shared empathy that transcended the walls of Buckingham Palace.